Morning everyone. So before the weekend, I left you all with a video where we were talking about the ArenaNet departures, the reveal of some unannounced projects, plural, at the studio and what the developers may have been working on. We talked about mobile development, we talked about a released concept art for an unknown sci-fi project, we talked about competitive elements of the studio once upon a time in the past, the potential for following bandwagons, VR, and so on. Now that's all well and good, but the other side is, what would we actually like to see? We have no way of knowing if these now cancelled secondary projects would have sold if ArenaNet got them to a release state, but the comments I got on the last video I made definitely show I'm not alone in cynicism over a few of them, particularly, I guess, the mobile prospects. So, what would we actually like to see? What do we, the established Guild Wars and ArenaNet fans, think would get us most excited coming from ArenaNet? What projects, had the devs have been working on, would truly devastate us to realize are now no more? So it's a fun question, and I've got what I would consider to be 4 awesome ideas for games I want to share with you guys and what ArenaNet could use as guidelines. They're not just ideas personally interesting to me, but several distinctly different things I think we can all get behind. But I do want to state here at the door, before we go wading in, one quite important factor that kind of, to an extent, discredits the idea of a discussion like this, and it's not lost on me. The thing is, if ArenaNet are pursuing other projects as a studio, it will be because they want to expand their established fan base. Presumptively, they want to look at new, larger markets and grow. Now, to grow, they can't constantly be catering to their established fan base. Every company, no matter what industry you're in, has to find this balance of, yes, exciting their existing users, but also finding new ones. And so, I think the perspective, response, and ideals of an established Guild Wars 2 fan when it comes to secondary or tertiary projects at the studio is probably of diminished worth. I, Wood and Potatoes, person following their product for a decade or so, may have very clear ideas and goals for them, but they've already found a way to get me to buy their product. I bought Path of Fire, I bought Heart of Thorns. Who they're really seeking, the Blizzard fans, the Final Fantasy XIV players, the mobile gamers, people from further afield, the everyman. It's almost more worth hearing a video from them. But hey, that's obviously not the full story, it's just something I wanted to add, because another side of this is that ArenaNet obviously can't go too far afield without somewhat making their existing user base feel betrayed, for lack of a better word. That's what I think we're seeing with the response to the idea of a mobile MMO over the past week or so. But it's about more than just the hyperbolic sense of betrayal when it comes to listening to the established users. I would go so far as to say that no matter how good ArenaNet's next project is, it could be the best game in the world. No matter how good it is, that project needs to pursue something that established fans have an instant good faith in. So it's not pilloried before it gets a chance to be judged fairly. So it gets a foot in the door. So people actually click on the early initial trailers where we have no idea if it's any good or not. It needs to be in a certain ballpark that people will afford it that initial attention. After that, if the game then also is genuinely good, then the studio will find massive success. But they do have a certain ballpark. ArenaNet giving us a hyper-realistic FPS, or a football game, or an educational game, is likely going to struggle majorly, regardless of the quality of those products. So how narrow is the field they can work in to engender good faith in someone like me? Well, I had a good think about this, and honestly, I think the answer is quite easy. And it's the answer to this, which kind of feeds into all the games you're about to hear me say. If ArenaNet are pursuing new projects, to me, there are 2 rules. 1, if it's not going to have Guild Wars-oriented gameplay and gameplay philosophies, so I'm talking Guild Wars-style buildcraft and combat pacing and freedom of movement, RPG sensibilities, all that stuff. if it's not offering that, if we are in a totally new genre, like we're not in an MMO, we're in an FPS now, a single-player game, a competitive-oriented game, if they are doing that, the rule is it should still at least be the Guild Wars IP. It's a game still to do with Tyria and Tyrians at some point in the past, the present, or the future with respect to Guild Wars 2. When you look at the skin of the game and the flavor of the game, it still feels related to the MMOs we have known over the past 10 years. In this, they can be incredibly creative with what the studio offers for experiences and pursue new markets, but they get their good faith from all the fans who still recognize Guild Wars as a place they are interested in. That's rule 1. Rule 2 is the opposite. If it's not the Guild Wars IP, and we don't recognize the place the game is giving us, it should still be influenced by Guild Wars and ArenaNet gameplay philosophies, honoring your time, freedom of movement, so on and so on. And in this way, they engender good faith from people because they'll say, oh, I recognize this kind of release cadence. This really suits me as a casual player. Or, oh, hey, I know that this next game's cash shop isn't going to be truly hideously pay to win because it's from ArenaNet, and I happen to have really respected the way they handled the gem store for so many years. Perhaps, you know, in comparison to other MMOs and so on. So those are the rules. And you'll see there's actually a lot of wiggle room in different products they could give us after that. I would also say this, that as far as I'm concerned, when it comes to that idea of Guild Wars gameplay, that's not actually one thing. There's a lot of arenas of thought here, but even at the most broad level, I would say there's no such thing as Guild Wars gameplay because there's two different games and they're both fully fledged different experiences with fundamentally different structuring. So actually, ArenaNet can get good faith from two quite distinct different types of gamer right now. The ones who love Guild Wars 2's style of online experience, and those who love Guild Wars 1's style of online experience. ArenaNet could make new MMOs for us, or they could make new CORPGs for us and look at the successes of games like Path of Exile rolling in their graves that they never pursued, a format they'd essentially perfected before any of these other companies did many years ago. It's no secret that most of the people who deride Guild Wars 2 are Guild Wars 1 fans upset that they're no longer catered to. Those are still adults out there with money and presumably video game fans that ArenaNet could appeal to with new projects. So, there's obviously thousands of different things I could say now, but I'll distill it down to my 4 most exciting projects as fed to by those rules. And for the first one on the list, we're already kind of talking about it. Game 1, project name, True Wars 2. This is the concept of a video game built to be entirely truthful to the Guild Wars 1 gameplay experience, except released now. A 2020s CORPG with the flashy new graphical rendering capabilities of this generation, but influenced and borrowing heavily from various Guild Wars 1 attributes. Hub-based grouping up and cooperative ideas. Guild Wars 1's idea behind leveling, going just up to 20 and then kind of bottoming them out very quickly. Guild Wars 1's ideas behind gear progression. Guild Wars 1's ideas behind skill capturing and elite skill capturing. Maybe Guild Wars 1's ideas with direct player trading. Guild Wars 1's visual aesthetic in terms of not making things too flashy too quickly. The campaign release structure rather than expansions. A return to factions-oriented guild grouping. GVGs, more limited access of movement. Maybe they take jumping away again. All these are elements that ArenaNet can pick and choose from based on which they think are the most important and most interesting, most translatable through to the current generation. That whole list I just offered, obviously wouldn't have to pick everything. People are going to have some they like more than they don't. But essentially to create a project that feels a lot more like Guild Wars 1 rather than Guild Wars 2. I would say, for example, the very static, slow caster oriented combat from Guild Wars 1 is probably too slow to cut the mustard these days. But the idea of a more limited skill bar where it really is only 8 abilities instead of, 15, 20, 25 as we see in the sequel might be a good direction to go into to create that more focused and refined buildcraft experience. So that's it for Game 1. I definitely think that it's a real thing ArenaNet could do well with. I don't think it would have to be of the scale that Guild Wars 2's at, since it's not an MMO. I don't think it would even have to be a lifestyle game that they continue to support in perpetuity and, burn their audience members as soon as new updates start coming out. I think if you look at a franchise like, say, the Borderlands one, you'll realize the way it paces itself and structures its story and released post-game updates and stuff is very similar to Guild Wars 1. It just never advertised itself as this thing that was always going to be updated, and people kind of accept it had an end date and now wait for Borderlands 3. Obviously, one's a looter shooter, the other one's an RPG, but the similarities, if you've played both, probably won't be lost on you. I think ArenaNet can look at stuff like that, and I definitely think they can look at the success of a game like PoE and wonder, is there something still for us to do in this genre we helped create? Several other very successful games get quite close to, but then we sort of abandoned. Importantly, looking back at our rules, this doesn't even have to be the Guild Wars IP. This doesn't have to be set hundreds of years after the Elder Dragons Crisis or during the actual Guild Wars. It doesn't need to have Guild Wars in the title. This can be a sci-fi epic, a cartoon world. It can be set on modern day Earth if you like. It doesn't matter. The good faith comes from the fact that they're hooking into an experience people know they made once before and they actually like. ArenaNet would win me and presumably many others on that promise and that idea alone. Game 2. Game 2, I'm hilariously project naming Guild Wars Wars. So, I'll explain why I've called it that in a second. This is what we get from one of the rules above. The idea of a totally different genre gameplay experience, new pastures altogether for ArenaNet, but sustaining the Guild Wars IP. So this would be an opportunity to show Tyria, the people and the places that we have come to know and love through these two games, at a very different scale, reimagining the lore and the world as we currently know it under new formats. One thing that's always rather disappointed me about the community at large when it comes to discussing Guild Wars lore and setting is how dogmatic and concrete they end up feeling about the places and events we see in the MMO. So for example, when you think Crater, you might be tempted to say, oh, it's this place with exactly 9 little villages and nothing more, because that's what, within the confines of MMO development, ArenaNet managed to find the time and space to add. When you think about the Zaitan conflict and the assault on Arar, or the fall of Claw Island, you probably think in very specific terms about the scale of those conflicts. Oh, it was about 10 to 15 NPCs fighting against 30 to 40 Risen. That's how big it was. You likely think of Divinity's Reach as a very finite place with a finite number of houses and people that populate it, because that's what the MMO has delivered to you, and we don't have much more to contrast it with outside of novels and blog posts. Not many people truly unpack the idea of the setting and the thrust of the story from how it is eventually delivered within a single product. That's one thing this project could help to break us away from. Give us new games in new engines and new genres, but still showing Tyria, and you can do wonderful things. Give me a war-based strategy game, for example, overseeing the armies of the Pact as they progress through Arar in the campaign against Zaitan. All of a sudden, the attempted epic scale the MMO fails to deliver might be fully realized as you genuinely see hundreds or thousands of units moving and engaging and interacting with one another. And I'm obviously not saying just recreate the Guild Wars 2 story. Give me that war-based strategy game, but instead overseeing the armies of the Char as they lose ground to humans and are pushed back into the northern territories and the Great Northern Wall is erected for the first time 1,000 years ago. The whole catalogue of strategy games I find super enticing. Give me a grand strategy empire building game where I get to lead the primitive Canthan people in their early years to struggle, moving north perhaps, claiming territories, struggling to keep the allegiances of the Kurziks and the Luxons. Maybe let me play as them en masse, overseeing their various emperors and empresses as they rise and fall. Give me a city builder game where I'm governing and nurturing the people of early Lion's Arch, tending to the newly developing outlying breadbasket colonies throughout Kryta. Maybe I'm governing Farana, the first city, as it grows to be a superpower early on Istan. I'm dealing with natural disasters that threaten my people like earthquakes, droughts, plagues strike me. These are opportunities not necessarily just to explicitly explore lore stories I would want more details on, but just the simple fact of having a game portraying Tyria at a different scale, such as a strategy game quite well illuminates here, I think, still gives us a lot to be excited about. You can reverse as well. It goes smaller scope. Let me just be a small town farmer somewhere in Tyria in a Harvest Moon, Stardew Valley style simulation game where I'm making very intimate connections with a selection of just a few NPCs living in peace at Pycon Square, that seemingly inconsequential location in GW1 and 2, but now feels like a dynamic, deep place where I'm not on some grand adventure and hero off to slay dragons or monsters or demons. I'm doing something quite different. Or maybe I am still an adventurer, but the game continues to be very refined in its aspirations, like a tactical dungeon crawler set mostly in the same place. Look at the first-person RPG blobbers like the classic Might and Magics or the Grimrock playthroughs I did here on my channel, with very clear starts and ends as we're, I don't know, descending into the depths of that bottomless hole in the far Shiver Peaks. So, going back to my project name, Guild Wars Wars, it's essentially a spin on what we saw Bungie so successfully do with its Halo franchise, creating Halo Wars, a different genre that showed the same place and people. Well, that's what I'd be proposing here for ArenaNet. You'll notice I haven't managed to nail down exactly what, and that's because I think pretty much any of them are really exciting. I'm not much of a sports game player, but if they released a standalone dedicated keg brawl simulation, I'd probably still give it a shot. And you'll notice here is where I think something like a Polymock mobile game might be acceptable. For Project 3, I do have a more specific thing to talk about. We're going with a project name, Tyria. And it's about not just Guild Wars 1 or Guild Wars 2, but it's about them both. What do they have in common? They're both third-person RPGs. Project Tyria would be about dropping the MMO part and delivering a fully fledged single-player RPG still set within Tyria that people can get behind. So I do think ArenaNet have had, over the years now, a lot of experience working with the exact same challenges that single-player RPGs have to deal with. While I'm not entirely sure they know how to deal leveling and gearing and loot and stuff, they do definitely have the aspects of exploration, collecting, ambience, and a pretty well fleshed out con world at their disposal. I think it's really interesting to look at much of what they've been doing for the main patches via Living World and expansions ever since, like, Living World Season 2. Look at what you actually experience as a gamer there. You log into Guild Wars, but is it really to do stuff with your guild or to do stuff in World vs. World or PvP or much of the multiplayer aspects? Not necessarily, maybe a few meta events, but what you're really doing is following those green starbursts and playing story instances, usually alone. Very rarely is the cooperative sides of these missions stressed, it's never required, and you're watching cutscenes, you're speaking to NPCs at your own pace, you're doing much of what you would do in a single player game. The way that ArenaNet are presenting voice acted dialogue and giving us cutscenes that intersplice throughout the missions, this is stuff that single player games do. If anything, as time has gone on, particularly since since Season 2, more and more of Guild Wars 2's MMO updates have felt far more single-player oriented, like they're aping single-player RPGs rather than embracing anything to do with the fact it's an MMO. I'm not joking, most of what this game adds has nothing to do with being massively multiplayer. It would work perfectly fine single-player or 1 to 4 player operated format. If anything, the MMO side of it is probably more of a nuisance that holds them back. So why not shed it away? Give us a dedicated game all about that. They've engendered good faith. The past 3 or 4 years have pretty much just been a testing ground for that stuff. Let's see what they can do. Give it a title like The Conquest of Kabaya, and then the subtitle, A Guild Wars Story. Players can go ahead, run on through it, and then, a couple of years later, release another one, almost like another chapter, an anthology series of single-player RPGs set in the main franchise that don't cannibalize your MMO players, but instead just possibly feed more people back into the MMO. I'll note here that there's a really long-term game the devs could play by pursuing this too, and that's that if they did end up having a whole branch and wing of successful single-player games they started putting out, there would come a point where people would buy single-player games that aren't Guild Wars IP related, and they're free to do pretty much anything. I think these games would need to have some kind of open world aspect to them, but that might be dangerous as it puts them into pretty direct competition with studios like Bethesda, who have even more practice and time to refine an experience like that. But I think they could do well. If you guys want me to really nail down a specific time and setting, I would probably go for setting it during the actual Guild Wars, or maybe during its prime time. One of those. I'd like to see the Cataclysm in a single-player game. That would be awesome. So, the 3 projects I just mentioned are probably the more important ones, the more realistic ones, and the main ones I'd like to present to you all. But I do have a 4th, and I think it's important to talk about. The 4th is Guild Wars 3. Another fully fledged MMO. And it's weird because if you look at the last video I did discussing what ArenaNet were probably doing, it seems they are clinging to that MMO idea rather than the RPG idea or experimenting with their IP. It seems they've identified themselves as an MMO studio. I mean, that's all highly speculative. But I actually think creating a new MMO is very dangerous. It's kind of like what we saw with Blizzard and their Titan project. To create a second MMO is to spend a ton of money presenting a new project that simply cannibalizes the established user base on your current MMO. And that's especially true if you're setting it in the same universe. We're not presenting a totally different sci-fi world here. We're presenting Guild Wars, just more of it. And when you're done fronting this massive cost for all of this, your players are likely to be spending about the same amount in the cash shop for your new MMO than they were in the old one, and your regular income doesn't change much because you've just shuffled people from one place to the next. Not only does that not make much economical business sense, it also kind of sucks the idea that you have this thriving, vibrant place reliant on high populations of players to push dynamic and meta events that now is abandoned. Guild Wars 1 is a good example of this. Once the sequel came out, even though the sequel is so different to the original, development ceased and no one's really around there anymore. But Guild Wars 1, luckily, is structured in a way that it works quite well with a minimalistic user base. Guild Wars 2 would really feel the sting of losing its player base. So it's a big risk for ArenaNet to sign on to the idea of a Guild Wars 3. Guild Wars 3 has to be new and fresh enough to not just shuffle the existing users, but capture lots of people from outside this fan base right now. And maybe they can do that more effectively by going in an even more divergent path. I'll note that there is a seemingly obvious solution here, that they don't stop development. I said it myself, Guild Wars 1 is probably only as empty as it is because they stopped developing for it. So keep developing. And in this way, you can have both projects earning money at the same time. But you have to acknowledge a few things, like the fact that many of your Guild Wars 3 players will also be Guild Wars 2 players, whose wallet is only so big. They'll probably just spend on the one game this month, not both together. What about the damage done by fracturing communities, as some people get the next game but others can't afford it or weren't interested enough? Do you need to spend the time and money on cross-game guild support and things now? At the very least, you have to acknowledge that once a proposed Guild Wars 3 that looks so much better and runs so much better and stuff is out, there'd very likely be less people tuning in for the continued Guild Wars 2 updates, and the studio's getting less bang for its buck developing that stuff than it was before, just because the sequel's out. I would say, as far as Guild Wars 1's concerned, I would still love to see them do new 2019 Guild Wars 1 campaign updates. I wonder if the idea was broached when the layoffs were announced and the studio was told to refocus on their Guild Wars stuff just last week. I think they'd be very successful if the devs weren't willing to go the whole hog of making a True Wars 2, that is. That was game idea 1. But that's because the two games and experiences are so different. Can we really expect a Guild Wars 3 to be as different from Guild Wars 2 as Guild Wars 2 was different from Guild Wars 1? Maybe, but maybe not. And without that kind of assurance, how can we know that Guild Wars 3 is divergent enough to allow for limited cannibalization and simultaneous profitable development of multiple MMOs at once? It's a lot to think about. The other side to this discussion too is just that of games as lifestyle long-term experiences. There's a question when you release a game like an MMO, and that's this: do games have shelf lives, and what are they? How long can we expect to continue coasting along with Guild Wars 2 and earn a lot of money and have excited fans and be content and happy with it? I think several years ago, the answer to that question would definitely have been that yes, games do have shelf lives, quite limited ones, and you can't hope to support and sustain on just the one forever. But maybe opinions on that are changing. I can't help but notice the number of games out there, like, say, Warframe, that are actually quite old, but end up finding popularity spikes several years down the road, just because the designers behind them have worked with them so well, and word of mouth advertising has ended up doing its job. RuneScape, a very old MMO, is just as relevant and huge today as just about as it always was. Particularly, funnily enough, their most recent success having been a port to mobile. But so I ask myself, in today's climate, is the end of the road for Guild Wars 2 truly inevitable in the next year? Certainly not. 5 years? 10? Is ArenaNet's hand actually being forced here? Well, I don't claim to have the answer, but I definitely can see the excitement for a Guild Wars 3, and that's why it makes my list here today. I do think certain features within Guild Wars become exponentially more difficult to deliver in interesting ways, like the mastery system, like eventually the elite specialization system will become, like finding creative, new, meaningful mounts for years and years on end. These things will become very difficult without radical overhauls to some of the structures of Guild Wars 2. And when we're at that point, maybe Guild Wars 3 is the right answer. And maybe that's what ArenaNet are now scurrying away to work on behind closed doors as of the events of the last week or so. So, those are the main 4 ideas. I do want to close out the video with one other little thought for you all. Most of what I've said in this video so far has been on a very ambitious, large scale. And I don't know whether that's necessarily what ArenaNet have to do. Just because we currently associate them with these big budget games that take a lot of work and you can play for hours and hours and hours on end, maybe the way out of this gridlock, if that's what ArenaNet's in, is actually to look at much smaller things that are not taken as seriously and with such enormous budgets, but just allow them to flirt with releasing new projects and test the waters, so to speak. Like if you look at Guild Wars 1 and 2 as such big games, to keep the audience interested in them at various times, the devs have made mini games and quite divergent experiences seated within them. So, I mean, like in Guild Wars 1, you had the Pac-Man style Jinundu challenge mission. In Guild Wars 2, you have activities like South Sun Survival, which is basically Battle Royale, right? They have MOBA attempts in both games. They have Roller Beetle Racing with actually quite convincing, racing controls in there. So I wonder whether the devs can actually look at any of these small experiences, see what the player base has really good faith in, and make a game that isn't a AAA slam dunk project, but just something small that keys into something they already have a bit of experience and good faith from the community in. just to diverse the studio's portfolio, as it were. Properly marketed and explained that it's not meant to be a really big deal. I don't think that short-term projects handled by small groups of talent are necessarily bad for ArenaNet's image. You can give us a small side-scrolling experience like Ritlock's Critter Rampage. You could give us video game novel experiences based on what they've learned about writing basically stories for blog posts and so on. You can make a point-and-click mystery adventure in the spirit of Marjorie Delacroix at the Dead End Bar. These kinds of things could go quite far. And of this category, I'll give you one big final idea I'm sure everyone would be excited about. One seriously bankable thing for the list. A fully featured, world-complete, standalone Super Adventure Box game. Maybe 1 to 4 players, but it's got all the worlds in there, you know, maybe even expands on the number of worlds. We think we have like 8 worlds or something. A Super Adventure Box all as a game of its own. I think something like that would be incredible, and I'm sure I'm not alone. Well, thanks for listening to the discussion today, guys. Let me know what you think, and I'll probably cool off from this subject for the next long while until we see what the studio is up to. Later today, as I record, I think we're getting a new mount, and balance is coming, so I'll be digging back into that. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you next time.